They struck oil by accident. And overnight, the Clampetts went from dirt poor to Beverly Hills millionaires. It was a fantasy millions of viewers fell in love with. But for the actors behind those characters, fame arrived just as suddenly and didn't fade nearly as quickly. Because once America sees you as someone like Jed Clampett, it can be hard to ever be anyone else again. And for Buddy Ebsen, the man behind that calm, steady patriarch, that question wasn't just theoretical. It defined the rest of his life. Before we go further, which character do you still remember most? Jed, Granny, Elly May, or Jethro? Hold on to that, because their real stories may not be what you expect. The Beverly Hillbillies premiered in 1962 and quickly became one of the most watched shows in America, running for nearly a decade. Its simple premise, a backwoods family navigating elite society, felt timeless. But behind that simplicity were careers, identities, and futures that would be shaped long after the show ended. Starting with Buddy Ebsen. Buddy Ebsen didn't walk into the Beverly Hillbillies as a newcomer chasing a break. By the time audiences met him as Jed Clampett, he had already lived several careers. He had danced on Broadway, acted in films, and even survived one of Hollywood's strangest near misses. Originally cast as the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, only to leave the role due to a severe reaction to the makeup. In a way, he had already learned that identity in Hollywood could shift overnight. That's what makes his portrayal of Jed feel so grounded. While everything around the character was exaggerated, Ebsen played him with a quiet steadiness. A man who didn't need to prove anything, even when surrounded by wealth he never asked for. And when the show ended, that same steadiness became his advantage. Unlike many of his co-stars, Ebsen wasn't trapped by the role. He transitioned into other successful projects, most notably Barnaby Jones, proving that audiences could see him as more than just Jed. There's something almost ironic in that. The man who played a character defined by sudden fortune was the one who understood how to sustain a career over time. Ebsen didn't chase reinvention. He simply kept working, adapting, and aging with a kind of quiet dignity that feels rare in Hollywood. And maybe that's why his story doesn't feel dramatic, but it does feel complete. Because while some actors spend years trying to escape a single role, others never quite find a second act at all. And that contrast becomes impossible to ignore when you look at someone like Irene Ryan. Irene Ryan was already a veteran long before she ever picked up Granny's shotgun or delivered one of her razor-sharp one-liners. To many viewers, she felt like she had always existed in that role, as if she had stepped fully formed out of the hills. But in reality, she had spent decades building her craft in vaudeville, radio, and film, learning how to command attention with timing, presence, and precision. Granny could have easily been a one-note joke. Instead, Ryan turned her into something unforgettable, equal parts stubborn, fierce, and strangely wise. There was rhythm in the way she spoke, a kind of controlled chaos that made every line land harder than expected. But what makes her story different is what came after. While many actors fade once a hit show ends, Ryan found something unexpected, a second peak. She transitioned to Broadway and earned critical acclaim for her role in Pippin, introducing herself to a completely new audience who had never known her as Granny at all. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a redefinition. And yet, there's a quiet poignancy in how that chapter ended. Her time on Pippin was cut short by illness, and she passed away not long after. But even in that, there's something meaningful. She didn't leave the stage as a relic of the past. She left it as a working performer, still evolving, still proving that her talent went far beyond a single television role. Which makes what comes next feel almost like the other side of the same coin. Because if Irene Ryan showed how a career could expand late in life, Max Baer Jr. reveals what happens when a role becomes almost impossible to outgrow. As Jethro Bodine, Max Baer Jr. created one of the most recognizable comedic characters of the era. The wide grin, the confident ignorance, the endless schemes. Jethro wasn't just funny, he was memorable in a way that stuck. Audiences didn't just watch him, they remembered him. And that memory became a double-edged sword. After the show ended, Baer faced a reality many actors quietly struggle with. People didn't see him as Max Baer Jr. They saw Jethro. Casting opportunities became limited, not because he lacked ability, but because the character had already defined him too completely in the public eye. But instead of forcing himself back into acting roles that didn't fit, he shifted direction. He moved behind the camera, producing and directing projects on his own terms. It wasn't the same kind of visibility, but it was control, something many actors never quite achieve. There's a certain determination in that choice. Rather than fighting the image audiences had of him, he stepped outside it entirely. Still, there's no denying the contrast. While Buddy Ebsen expanded and Irene Ryan reinvented, Baer had to navigate around a version of himself that the world refused to forget. And that tension, between how someone is seen and who they actually are, becomes even more interesting when you look at Donna Douglas. As Elly May Clampett, Donna Douglas embodied a kind of innocence that felt almost timeless. She wasn't just the beautiful one. She was warm, kind, and completely unpretentious in a world that often valued the opposite. There was no irony in her performance. That sincerity is what made her stand out. But unlike many who try to hold on to that image, Douglas chose a different path once the show ended. She stepped away from the constant pursuit of Hollywood roles and moved toward a quieter, more personal life. She focused on her faith, her family, and projects that reflected her values rather than chasing visibility. In an industry that often rewards reinvention at any cost, her decision feels almost radical in its simplicity. She didn't try to prove she was different from Elly May. In some ways, she leaned into the same warmth and authenticity, just without the cameras. And maybe that's why her story feels so grounded. Not every life after fame has to be a comeback or a struggle. Sometimes, it's a conscious choice to step into something more meaningful, even if it's less visible. Because by this point, a pattern starts to emerge. Some actors fight to escape their roles. Some redefine themselves. And some quietly carry the same spirit into a completely different life. And once you start to see that pattern, it changes how you look at all of them. The Beverly Hillbillies was built on a simple fantasy. Strike oil, change your life overnight, and everything gets better from there. It's clean, fast, and comforting. But the real lives behind that story didn't follow the same script. Because fame works in a strangely similar way. It can arrive suddenly, reshape everything, and open doors that never existed before. But it can also fix a person in place. Not physically, but in the way they're seen, remembered, and expected to remain. For this cast, success didn't just bring opportunity. It quietly defined the boundaries of what came next. Buddy Ebsen found a way to move forward without losing himself. Irene Ryan proved she could become something new even late in life. Max Baer Jr. had to step outside the spotlight to regain control. And Donna Douglas chose a path that had nothing to do with staying visible at all. Same show, Same starting point, completely different outcomes. And once you see that, the question shifts. It's no longer just about what happened after the cameras stopped rolling, but what it actually costs to be remembered in only one way for the rest of your life. Because in the second half of this story, that cost becomes harder to ignore. If the Clampetts represented innocence dropped into wealth, Raymond Bailey's Milburn Drysdale stood for the opposite: refinement, control, and the quiet confidence of someone who already belonged. He was the gatekeeper of high society, always composed, always calculating, and often just one step away from losing patience with the chaos around him. But Bailey's real life didn't carry that same polished ease. Before the show, he had spent years building a steady career in film and television, often in smaller roles that required discipline more than recognition. By the time he became Drysdale, he understood exactly how to play authority, not as arrogance, but as structure. And that's what made his performance feel so believable. Yet in his later years, that sense of control began to slip in ways that audiences never saw coming. The man who once embodied sharpness and precision faced personal challenges that stood in quiet contrast to the character people remembered. There's something deeply human in that. The idea that even those who appear most put together on screen are still vulnerable to time in ways no role can protect them from. Bailey didn't reinvent himself like some of his co-stars. His story feels more like a gradual fading of the image people held onto, while life continued to move in a different direction behind the scenes. And that contrast between how someone is perceived and how they actually live becomes even more striking when you look at Nancy Culp. As Miss Jane Hathaway, Nancy Culp brought intelligence and sincerity into a world that often leaned into caricature. She wasn't just the loyal assistant. She was sharp, capable, and often the most grounded person in the room. There was a quiet dignity in her performance that made her stand out without ever needing to dominate the scene. But what makes her story remarkable is what came after. While many actors struggled to separate themselves from their roles, Culp chose a path that had nothing to do with Hollywood at all. She stepped into public life, teaching, speaking, and eventually entering politics. It wasn't a reinvention for the sake of image. It felt like a continuation of who she already was. There's something admirable in that kind of transition. She didn't fight her past, and she didn't try to erase it. Instead, she built on it, channeling the intelligence and composure people saw on screen into something tangible in the real world. And yet, even with that strength, her journey carried its own challenges. Public life comes with its own pressures, its own expectations, and its own forms of scrutiny. But through it all, there's a sense that Culp remained consistent, not just as a performer, but as a person, which makes her story feel less like an escape from typecasting and more like a quiet evolution beyond it. And when you widen the lens beyond the main cast, that evolution becomes harder to find. Because for many of the supporting players who passed through the Beverly Hillbillies, recognition came quickly, but didn't always last in a meaningful way. Recurring characters, guest stars, familiar faces who appeared just enough to be remembered. They all became part of the show's world. But outside of it, their paths often followed a different pattern. Smaller roles, fewer opportunities, and the gradual shift from being seen regularly to being remembered occasionally. It's not failure, it's something more subtle. A kind of in-between space where success is real, but not lasting in the way people imagine. Where a role can define a moment, but not necessarily a lifetime. And in that sense, the supporting cast reflects a quieter truth about the industry itself. Not everyone gets a second act. Not everyone finds a new identity. Sometimes the work remains, the memories stay, but the person behind them slowly moves out of view. And that realization brings us to something deeper. Because when you step back and look at all of these stories together, one question starts to rise above the rest. There's something comforting about the way we remember shows like the Beverly Hillbillies. The characters don't age. The jokes land the same way. The world feels frozen in a kind of perfect loop where nothing really changes. But the people inside that world, they do. And that's where the story becomes more complicated. Because when an actor becomes closely tied to a single role, something subtle begins to happen. Over time, the character stops being just a performance and starts becoming the lens through which the audience sees the person. Jed is always calm. Granny is always sharp. Jethro is always foolish. Elly May is always gentle. Those identities don't fade, they settle. But real life doesn't work that way. Years pass, priorities shift, health changes, ambitions evolve. Some actors grow beyond what audiences expect. Others step away entirely. But no matter what they do, there's always a part of them that remains fixed in time, preserved in reruns, remembered in a very specific way. And that creates a quiet tension. Because while the audience gets to revisit the same version of someone over and over again, the person themselves has to keep moving forward. They have to live with the distance between who they were and who they've become. For some, like Buddy Ebsen, that distance becomes manageable, even empowering. For others, like Max Baer Jr., it becomes something to navigate around. And for many, it's simply a reality they learn to carry without ever fully escaping. In a way, being remembered so clearly is a kind of success. But it's also a kind of permanence. And permanence can be both a gift and a limitation. Because the truth is, most actors don't get to decide how they're remembered. That decision belongs to the audience, to the millions of people who saw them at one moment in time and chose to hold on to it. And maybe that's the real cost behind shows like this. Not fame, not success, but being remembered in only one way. And maybe that's why the Beverly Hillbillies still stays with us after all these years. On the surface, it was simple. A family strikes oil, moves to Beverly Hills, and everything feels upside down in the most entertaining way. But underneath that simplicity, it captured something deeper about its time. A country fascinated by change, by class, by the idea that life could transform overnight. What it couldn't show was what happens after that transformation. Because behind every familiar face on that screen was a life that kept unfolding long after the laughter faded. Careers shifted, identities evolved. Some found new paths, others stepped away, and some carried the weight of being remembered in a very specific way for the rest of their lives. And yet, none of that takes away from what they created. If anything, it adds to it. Because when you watch those episodes now, you're not just seeing characters anymore. You're seeing moments, preserved pieces of people who lived, changed, struggled, and endured in ways the audience never fully saw at the time. And maybe that's the real legacy of a show like this. Not just that it made people laugh, but that it gave us something worth remembering, even as the people behind it continued moving forward. If this brought back memories for you, I'd love to hear which cast member surprised you the most, and what the Beverly Hillbillies meant to you growing up. And if you enjoy revisiting stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys into the lives behind the shows we thought we knew.